In the winter of 1973 in rural Michigan, a cold case began. One that would remain unsolved for nearly 3 decades. It started with the sudden disappearance of 20-year-old Dawn Lee Swan Magyar, a young mother known for her quiet kindness and devotion to her family. After a simple afternoon grocery run, she never made it home. Her truck was found abandoned, her keys scattered across the pavement. Clear signs something had gone terribly wrong. Investigators combed fields, rivers, and frozen woods, but every lead dissolved into silence. Years turned into decades, until a single strand of DNA finally cracked the case open. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. On the morning of January 27, 1973, Michigan rested under a heavy winter stillness, the kind where sound seems to soften and time feels suspended. Frost clung to every window pane. Cold air hung in quiet pockets between houses and bare trees. In the small town of Chesaning, life carried on in its usual slow rhythm, unchanged by the season. And inside a modest family home, 20-year-old Dawn Lee Magyar was moving through her morning as she always did, caring for her 1-year-old son, tidying the kitchen, and preparing for an afternoon grocery run. Dawn had just celebrated her son's first birthday with her husband, Don. The celebration was simple but full of warmth, all pastel frosting and the laughter of young parents learning their way through early adulthood. Dawn was a young mother, a homemaker, and a daughter of Michigan through and through. Her life was predictable, grounded, and full of routines that kept her anchored. But on this particular morning, something unseen was already shifting. Around midday, Dawn borrowed a truck to pick up groceries in the nearby town of Owasso. It was only a 15-minute drive along familiar roads, farmland on both sides, telephone poles cutting through the winter fog. She had made that drive countless times. It was a mundane errand, the kind that required little thought. Put on a coat, warm the truck, make a list, go. Witnesses later recalled that Dawn was her usual self inside the supermarket. Friendly, relaxed, and carrying the easy glow of a young mother with plans for the weekend. One friend bumped into her in the checkout line and remembered Dawn smiling, holding the small talk that neighbors often used to stitch everyday life together. Nothing about that moment hinted at danger. Nothing hinted at the abyss waiting just outside those glass doors. Dawn paid for her items, gathered her bags, and stepped into the cold Michigan air. The parking lot, like most winter afternoons, was busy enough to feel safe but quiet enough to disappear into. She walked toward the truck, groceries balanced in her arms. Somewhere between the supermarket exit and the truck's driver's side door, something happened. Something sudden, violent, and silent enough that no one noticed until it was far too late. Hours passed. The daylight faded, and Dawn never came home. At first, Dawn assumed a delay, a flat tire, a neighbor stopping to chat. But as the sun dipped below the frozen horizon, his unease hardened into fear. He called family, he called friends, and finally he called the police. Officers arrived at the shopping center and found the truck exactly where it had been parked. Inside were Dawn's neatly packed groceries. Outside, scattered across the icy pavement, were her keys. It looked like they had been dropped or ripped from her hand. There was no sign of Dawn, no footprints, no witnesses, just a quiet winter parking lot holding onto its secrets. And as investigators stared at those keys on the ground, one chilling question hovered in the air. How does someone vanish in a place this public, without a trace? Once news of Dawn's disappearance rippled through Chesaning and Owasso, something extraordinary happened. Something that small towns in the Midwest are known for, but that still feels remarkable every time it occurs. People dropped everything. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers were gathering at the shopping center. By the next morning, that number had swelled into the thousands. Farmers came in from their fields, still wearing heavy boots caked with mud and ice. Factory workers left mid-shift. Teachers, retirees, teenagers, and off-duty police officers bundled themselves in layers and prepared to search miles of frozen ground. The winter sun cast a pale glow over the parking lot as organizers handed out maps and marked grids. The community wasn't just looking for clues. They were looking for Dawn, someone they knew, someone whose warmth had touched their lives. Search parties spread across Shiawassee County, trudging through fields where snow crackled beneath their feet. They scanned fences, ravines, and abandoned outbuildings. Others moved into wooded areas where bare branches scraped against one another in the wind, creating an eerie, restless soundtrack. Volunteers peered into drainage ditches and culverts, calling her name again and again. But each call drifted into the cold air unanswered. Police K-9 units picked up Dawn sent early in the search, but the trail stopped abruptly, as if something or someone had severed it. Helicopters hovered overhead, their blades sending ripples through the trees below as spotters watched for any disturbance in the snow. A footprint, a piece of fabric, anything. Days passed, then a week. The intensity of the search did not falter. People showed up every morning, numb from the cold but driven by the belief that Dawn was still out there somewhere. Injured, lost, waiting to be found. Every unexplored patch of land felt like a door that could still open to hope. But as the second week crept in, optimism began to fade. The leads that once felt promising now felt vague, almost imaginary. No one had seen her being taken. No one saw a suspicious vehicle. The truck's scattered keys pointed to a struggle, yet there were no footprints leading away from the scene. Snow had a cruel way of hiding the truth. By the third week, the tone of the search changed. Volunteers still came, but the conversations quieted. People moved with heavier steps, their eyes scanning the ground with growing dread rather than hope. Investigators reviewed every inch of the case file, looking for anything they might have missed. But nothing connected. Nothing pointed to a suspect, or even a direction in which she might have gone. Police began asking a darker question. Was this abduction random, or was someone watching, for the perfect moment to strike? The winter deepened, swallowing evidence and time. And for nearly 5 weeks, there was nothing but silence. Until 2 young brothers, walking the edges of their family's maple grove, stumbled upon something that would bring the entire investigation to a brutal and heartbreaking shift. March 4, 1973, began like any other late winter Sunday in rural Saginaw County. The thaw hadn't arrived yet. The woods were still brittle and bare, the ground frozen in patches that crunched underfoot. On a family farm just outside Chapin, 2 young brothers, Wayne and Bill Summers, were tapping maple trees, checking early-season sap lines. For them, it was a familiar chore, something they had done many times before, wandering through the quiet stand of trees without a worry in the world. But that morning something felt off. As they moved deeper into the woods, Wayne noticed an odd shape among the underbrush. At first, he thought it was a pile of discarded clothing. People sometimes dump things along the tree line. But as the brothers approached, the shape became unmistakably human. A flash of fabric, the curve of a shoulder, something pale beneath layers of leaves and debris. They froze. Children rarely understand the full weight of their discoveries, but they know fear and they knew it now. Wayne ran back toward the house, shouting for their father. Minutes later, police vehicles were winding down the dirt driveway, tires crunching over remnants of frost. Officers moved quickly, marking off the area, calling for detectives, and working silently beneath the tall, bare branches that swayed in the cold wind. When investigators reached the body, the scene was painfully clear. It was Dawn. More than 5 weeks of searching had ended in a quiet Michigan woodlet, far from the shopping center where she vanished, far from the countless volunteers who had combed fields, ditches, and frozen marshes. The distance was both shocking and heartbreaking. Dawn had been close enough for someone familiar with the area to hide her without being seen. Close enough to suggest that whoever took her knew these back roads and wooded pockets well. The autopsy that followed confirmed the nightmare. Dawn had been sexually assaulted. She had been shot 3 times, twice in the head, once in the back, with a .22 caliber weapon. The medical examiner delivered another detail that hit investigators like a punch. She had likely died within 90 minutes of being abducted. That meant that while thousands of people searched later that same day, Dawn had already been gone. Any chance to save her had disappeared almost as quickly as she had. Detectives now had a homicide. They had physical trauma, a cause of death, and traces of biological evidence. They also had an approximate weapon type. But evidence alone wasn't the same as answers. And in 1973, forensic science was decades away from harnessing DNA. Artifacts remained artifacts. Promising, frustrating, and painfully incomplete. Still, the investigation pressed on. Detectives sifted through the dirt around the scene, searching for tire tracks or footprints, but winter had long since erased them. They canvassed local residents. They checked every registered .22 caliber gun owner in the area. They interviewed hunters, farmers, ex-convicts, strangers passing through town, anyone who might have fired a .22 or owned one. Nothing connected. A year passed. Then another clue, a strange, almost unbelievable one, surfaced in June of 1974. A .22 caliber revolver was pulled from the Shiawassee River in Owasso, not far from where Dawn had vanished. The gun was rusted, still loaded, and incapable of firing. But inside were 3 spent rounds, the same brands used to kill Dawn. The weapon had traveled the same county lines her abductor had. Investigators traced it to a pawn shop in Yuma, Arizona. The buyer, a man named Robert Shaw, seemed bewildered when authorities contacted him. He swore he hadn't seen the gun in years. If Shaw wasn't lying, and the evidence supported that he wasn't, then the revolver had changed hands. So the question became darker, more precise, and far more unsettling. If it wasn't Shaw, then who had been holding his gun on the night Dawn disappeared? For years, the revolver found in the Shiawassee River sat at the center of a frustrating mystery. Investigators knew it had been used to kill Dawn. They knew it had originated in a pawn shop in Yuma, Arizona. But the man who purchased it, Robert Shaw, lived across the country and insisted he had no connection whatsoever to Michigan. When detectives questioned him, he seemed genuinely baffled. He had never heard of Dawn, had no ties to the state, and had no reason to travel there in the early 1970s. He told police that the gun had gone missing long before Dawn's murder, but he could not recall when, where, or how it happened. For investigators, this was both reassuring and maddening. Shaw was clearly not their man, but his missing gun had somehow made its way into the hands of a killer. And without knowing who took it, they were staring at a gap in the timeline that felt nearly impossible to fill. Years passed. Evidence aged. Witness memories dissolved. The case slipped further into the cold. Then, in the late 1990s, more than 25 years after the murder, something unexpected happened. Shaw contacted authorities with a detail he had recently remembered, a detail that had once seemed trivial but now felt strangely important. After his divorce, he said, his ex-wife had briefly dated a man named Gerald Leroy Wingart. Shaw recalled Wingart being inside his home during that period. He remembered him handling things, moving freely through rooms where personal belongings, including the revolver, were stored. He couldn't say for sure that Wingart had taken the gun, but he couldn't rule it out either. It was the kind of faint, flickering lead detectives often ignored for lack of substance. But in a decades-old murder with almost no living evidence left, even a flicker mattered. Investigators decided to search deeper into Wingart's past, and what they found sent a chill through them. Long before becoming a quiet Michigan resident, Wingart had been a promising engineering student at the University of Michigan. He was married, attending classes on scholarship, and living a life that seemed stable on the surface. But in 1961, everything shattered. Wingart was arrested and later convicted for the brutal rape of a blind female student. He had assaulted her and robbed her escort at knife point. The violence was shocking, calculated, and deliberate. He served 6 years in prison. When detectives unearthed this history, they were stunned. This wasn't a petty criminal with a troubled past. This was a man capable of extreme violence. Yet after his release, Wingart had been paroled, completed his supervision, and quietly blended into society. He later became a long-haul trucker, lived in several states, remarried multiple times, and eventually settled in Center Line, Michigan. By the late 1990s, he was 60 years old, working respectably in the accounting office of a Chrysler plant. He was known for his computer skills, his polite manner, and his unremarkable life. Neighbors liked him. Co-workers respected him. He was, by all appearances, a normal man. But investigators couldn't ignore the darker layers beneath his carefully maintained surface. Could a violent offender from the 1960s, now decades older, really be the same predator who abducted and murdered Dawn in 1973? If he was, then he had managed to hide in plain sight for almost 30 years. But suspicion alone meant nothing in court. The old days of circumstantial evidence were gone. Investigators needed hard proof. Proof strong enough to survive time, scrutiny, and a defense team. And thanks to the evolution of forensic science, that proof finally existed. Now they just had to get their hands on his DNA. By the late 1970s, Dawn's case had exhausted almost every path investigators could follow. Detectives had chased hundreds of leads that started promising but fizzled into nothing. They had interviewed local men, out-of-state drifters, former offenders, acquaintances, strangers. Anyone who might have crossed paths with a young woman shopping on a winter afternoon in Owasso. They re-examined the crime scene photos repeatedly, hoping fresh eyes might catch something missed in the chaos of the initial investigation. They revisited the shopping center, reviewed witness statements, and even looked into possible serial offenders moving through Michigan during that era. But nothing connected to a single suspect. Nothing formed a narrative strong enough to hold. The biological evidence collected during Dawn's autopsy, what would one day become the key to solving her murder, was little more than a frustrating reminder of technological limitations. In the 1970s, there was no DNA profiling, no genetic databases, no method to match a perpetrator to the smallest trace left behind. Investigators had samples, but they were essentially useless. Evidence without identification, answers without a name. And as each year passed, the investigation grew colder. For Dawn's family, time did not heal, it hardened. Her parents, Eleanor and Ralph, carried the grief in private ways. Her brothers, Max and Larry, grew into adulthood with the unresolved absence of their sister. They married, had children, and built lives she would never be part of. Her son, barely 1 year old when she disappeared, grew up with only faint memories and photographs of the mother who should have been there for his first steps, first words, and first day of school. Every year felt like another layer of dust settling over Dawn's story, another layer of silence settling over the truth. Detectives retired. Case files were boxed up and moved to storage. Evidence was cataloged and packed away. Dawn's name became one more line in a long list of Michigan cold cases. Unsolved, unanswered, and fading from public conversation. But not from memory. Not from the hearts of those who loved her. Then, in the mid-1990s, a shift occurred. The Michigan State Police began forming specialized units dedicated to long-dormant investigations. Cold case detectives, armed with a new generation of forensic tools, started reopening files that had once seemed hopeless. One detective, reviewing Dawn's archive, noticed something that earlier investigators had never been able to use: pelleted biological samples preserved in sealed containers, stored properly, and still intact. It was a small detail, but small details often make all the difference. The detective consulted a forensic expert, who explained that DNA technology had advanced far beyond anything available at the time of Dawn's murder. Even degraded samples, decades old, could potentially produce profiles. The possibility was no longer theoretical. It was real, and it was revolutionary. But there was no guarantee. Time destroys evidence. Temperature fluctuations degrade genetic material. Even the smallest mistake in storage could render a sample unusable. So the central question became painfully simple, yet enormous in consequence. Had the DNA survived? If it had, the case could be resurrected. If it hadn't, Dawn's file might return to the cold forever. The answer would determine everything that happened next. When the cold case detective carried Dawn's preserved evidence into the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, no one knew whether the material inside those small containers would be usable. More than 2 decades had passed. In many cases, time erodes biological samples beyond recognition. Temperature changes, moisture exposure, and simple degradation can destroy everything investigators hope to find. But Dawn's case was different. The original investigators had stored the samples meticulously, sealing them tightly and keeping them in conditions that, unknowingly, preserved her last chance at justice. As the containers were opened and the samples reviewed under careful gloved hands, a quiet tension filled the laboratory. Technicians specializing in degraded DNA evidence began the long, tedious process of extraction. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't quick. It required patience, precision, and hope. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Every step demanded accuracy. Any contamination, any misplaced strand, could compromise the entire test. Technicians reran the processes again and again, looking for repeating markers, tiny genetic flags that could confirm the integrity of the material. DNA from the victim was identified first. Then came the harder task, isolating DNA belonging to someone else. One afternoon, a lab analyst called the supervising scientist over. The computer screen displayed something extraordinary. Clean peaks, clear markers, and readable alleles. The foreign DNA had survived, not as fragments, not as partial patterns, but as a full, viable genetic profile of the perpetrator. It was, in forensic terms, a miracle. Now investigators held something they had never possessed before: a genetic fingerprint, a silent witness that didn't forget, didn't change its story, and didn't care how much time had passed. The next phase required immense care. Detectives needed DNA comparisons, but quietly. They didn't want a potential suspect to panic or flee. One by one, they obtained samples from the men who had been in Dawn's orbit in 1973. Her husband was cleared. Family members, too. Old boyfriends, acquaintances, and co-workers. All cleared. Even Robert Shaw, the original gun owner, submitted DNA willingly. His profile didn't match. Each elimination was both progress and frustration. If not them, then who? One name lingered on the periphery of the investigation: Gerald Leroy Wingart. A man with a violent past, a suspicious history, and a connection, however distant, to the missing gun. But Wingart wasn't just some drifter. He was a man who had rebuilt himself across decades. He had a stable job, a reputation, a community that saw him as steady and reliable. He lived quietly with his fourth wife, paid his bills, and blended in effortlessly. There was no universe in which he would voluntarily hand over his DNA. So investigators turned to a tactic often used in cases where cooperation is unlikely: covert collection. They followed him, observed him, tracked his routines, his habits, his public spaces. They waited for him to discard something containing saliva, something legally collectible once thrown away. Days of surveillance paid off one evening when Wingart stepped outside, smoked a cigarette, and flicked the butt into his household trash. As soon as the bin hit the curb, investigators moved in and retrieved it. The cigarette was rushed to the forensic lab. When the results came back, they were immediate and unequivocal. The DNA from Wingart's cigarette matched the profile extracted from Dawn's preserved evidence. A match with statistical certainty so overwhelming it might as well have been a confession. After decades of silence, Dawn's case finally had a name attached to it. But as investigators prepared to confront that name, one question loomed over everything. How would this quiet, respected man react when confronted with a past he thought he had buried forever? When the call came in from the DNA lab, investigators knew instantly that something had changed. Cold cases rarely get moments of clarity. Years of speculation, false starts, and dead ends tend to blur together. But this moment was different. The forensic analyst's voice carried a weight that every detective understood. The genetic profile extracted from Dawn's evidence matched the DNA lifted from Gerald Leroy Wingart's discarded cigarette. It wasn't a partial match or a statistical maybe. It was precise. It was definitive. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, the question of who took Dawn from the world had a concrete answer. The next step was to reconstruct Wingart's life around the time of the crime. Cold case detectives combed through archived records, phone directories, employment logs, and travel histories. What they found was chilling in its simplicity. In January 1973, Wingart had been in the Owasso area visiting a friend. He had no documented reason to be near the shopping center where Dawn vanished, No legitimate explanation for being in Shiawassee County at all. And there was no evidence, none whatsoever, that he had ever met Dawn or her family. This wasn't a crime born of familiarity. It was a predator acting on opportunity. Still, DNA alone, though powerful, had to be supported. Prosecutors needed a case that could withstand scrutiny, especially given the time that had passed. So detectives dug back into the old files, revisiting everything with fresh eyes. They reevaluated witness statements from 1973, searching for details that now carried new meaning. They re-examined the revolver found in the river, correlating its disappearance from Robert Shaw's home with the time Wingart had been present there. They checked employment records and parole notes, tracing Wingart's movements around the state. Piece by piece, a picture formed, a timeline of a man with violent tendencies, access to the murder weapon, and opportunity to strike. Everything aligned. Only once the evidence was airtight did prosecutors move forward. On March 7, 2001, officers surrounded Wingart's home. He was 60 years old, gray-haired, soft-spoken, and living what appeared to be an unremarkable life with his fourth wife in Center Line, Michigan. He opened the door calmly, unaware that decades-old evidence had finally caught up to him. When investigators explained why they were there, his expression shifted, but not to panic. Instead, he insisted he had done nothing wrong. He claimed he had no idea who Dawn was. But DNA doesn't lie, and he couldn't explain how his genetic material appeared on her body. Still, an arrest is not a conviction. The next challenge would be far more difficult. Convincing a jury after 28 years that the science was sound, the timeline was reliable, and the man standing trial had been responsible for a murder long buried by time and silence. The question lingered like a shadow over the courthouse. Would the jury believe the evidence? Or the man who had spent decades hiding behind normalcy? By November 2001, nearly 3 decades of silence, doubt, and unanswered questions had brought an entire community to the Shiawassee County Courthouse. People who had searched for Dawn in freezing fields now sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches. Retired detectives returned to witness the moment they had fought for. Journalists filed into the back rows, flipping open notepads. And at the front, Dawn's family, older now, marked by years of grief, watched quietly, bracing for the trial they had once thought would never come. The prosecution began with the most powerful element of the case: the DNA. Experts walked the jury through the science, explaining how biological evidence preserved from 1973 had been extracted, analyzed, and matched with absolute certainty to Gerald Leroy Wingart. Charts and genetic markers were projected on screens. Lab analysts detailed their process step by step, emphasizing the rigor and redundancy of the testing. The message was unmistakable. The match wasn't hypothetical. It wasn't partial. It was definitive. Next came the timeline. Prosecutors revealed that Wingart had been in the Owasso area on the very day Dawn disappeared, visiting a friend just miles from the shopping center. He had no alibi, no reason to be there, and no connection to Dawn that could explain their physical interaction. The randomness of the crime made it more disturbing, not less. Then came the revolver, the weapon found rusting in the Shiawassee River in 1974. Prosecutors showed the jury the spent rounds, which matched the ammunition used to kill Dawn. They presented evidence tracing the gun back to Robert Shaw, who testified about its disappearance around the time his ex-wife began dating Wingart. It was circumstantial, yes, but compelling. The weapon had traveled across states and years, only to resurface in the same county where Dawn's life had been taken. And then the prosecution unveiled the part of the story that cast the deepest shadow: Wingart's past. They revealed his 1961 conviction for the rape of a blind University of Michigan student and the armed robbery of her escort. Jurors learned how he had ambushed the couple, used fear as a weapon, and assaulted his victim with chilling brutality. The courtroom grew still as the parallels emerged: violence, sexual assault, predatory behavior. But the defense countered with a claim that left the room buzzing. Wingart's attorney argued that he had engaged in consensual sex with Dawn. It was a strategy that aimed to twist the narrative, to inject doubt by suggesting a connection between the two that investigators had missed. For Dawn's family, the accusation was agonizing. For those who knew her, it felt not only impossible but insulting. The prosecution responded swiftly. Forensic experts testified that the DNA was left during a narrow and violent window between Dawn's abduction and the time she was killed. They explained that the timeline made any idea of consensual contact not only implausible, but scientifically impossible. Dawn had never left that parking lot willingly. She had never met Wingart, and she had never stood a chance. After days of testimony and hours of closing arguments, the jury retreated to deliberate. The courthouse waited. Dawn's family held hands. Investigators tried to read the expressions of those emerging from the deliberation room. And when the jury finally returned, their verdict came swift, clear, and unwavering. Guilty of first-degree murder. For Dawn's family, it was justice, long delayed, but finally delivered. Yet as the courtroom emptied and the weight of the verdict settled, investigators were left with one lingering, unsettling question. If Wingart had killed Dawn, was she his only victim? In the months following Gerald Wingart's conviction, Michigan investigators found themselves unable to close Dawn's file without confronting a troubling possibility, one that had lingered in the background for years but had never been fully addressed. If Wingart had abducted and murdered a young mother in 1973, seemingly at random, what were the chances that Dawn had been his only victim? Statistically, behavior like his rarely appeared in isolation. And as detectives began to pull old case files out of archives, a pattern started to emerge, faint but deeply unsettling. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Wingart moved frequently. He lived in Washtenaw County, Ionia County, Eaton Rapids, and even out of state in New York. He switched jobs often, sometimes abruptly. Each time investigators placed pins on a map showing his movements, they noticed that certain counties had unsolved cases involving young women around the same time windows he was living or working there. The coincidences were difficult to ignore. One case, in particular, resurfaced with new urgency: the 1979 rape and murder of 16-year-old Laura Mae McVeigh near Hubbardston in Ionia County. Laura had disappeared while walking home, and her body was found weeks later in a wooded area. The brutality mirrored certain elements of Dawn's case. And back in 1981, only 2 years after Laura's death, Wingart had been arrested for her murder. But the charges were dismissed, not because he was cleared, but because a judge ruled investigators had mishandled aspects of the search for evidence. Procedural errors shut the case down before it reached a jury. Now, with Wingart behind bars for Dawn's murder, investigators revisited Laura's file with renewed determination. They knew DNA could make or break what had once been a fragile case. They believed that advancements in technology, combined with the precedent of Dawn's conviction, could open doors previously sealed shut. The Michigan Attorney General's office reviewed evidence. State police re-interviewed witnesses. There was talk, even hope, that DNA might still be extractable from Laura's preserved samples. But the deeper detectives dug, the more cases seemed to tug at the edges of Wingart's history. Young women assaulted in Ann Arbor. Teenagers who vanished near rural highways. Unsolved murders in counties he had left abruptly. None of these cases alone were conclusive, but together they formed a chilling mosaic, one that suggested Dawn may have been one piece of a much larger, much darker story. For the public, these revelations stirred fear. The idea that a quiet man, a man who worked in an accounting office and lived in a peaceful neighborhood, could have operated undetected for decades felt almost unimaginable. People began asking themselves if they had ever crossed paths with him, if they had ever trusted him, if they had ever dismissed something that, in hindsight, might have mattered. For Dawn's family, the conviction brought a measure of peace. Justice finally served, a truth finally spoken aloud. But even they could not escape the lingering question. Was their daughter the only one? As investigators sifted through old files and prepared for potential new charges, one truth became painfully clear. Dawn's story had been solved, but the shadows surrounding Wingart's past were far from fully illuminated. And somewhere, buried in cold case archives across Michigan, answers might still be waiting. Dawn Lee Swan Magyar's story is one woven with heartbreak, endurance, and the quiet strength of those who refused to let her memory fade. For nearly 30 years, Her case rested in a cold file drawer, wrapped in shadows and unanswered questions. Families change, communities shift, and time pushes forward. But Dawn's absence remained a wound that never fully healed. Her parents carried that sorrow for the rest of their lives. Her brothers lived with the weight of not knowing. And her young son grew up never hearing his mother's voice or feeling her hand in his. But time did not defeat the truth. It simply waited for the moment when science, persistence, and justice would finally align. When cold case detectives reopened Dawn's file in the 1990s, they found the one thing earlier investigators never had: the possibility that technology could speak where witnesses could not. DNA evidence, something unimaginable when Dawn was taken, became the force that brought her story back into the light. With a single genetic match, the silence of decades finally cracked open. Wingart's conviction and his eventual death in prison do not erase the pain of what Dawn endured, but they stand as a testament to what unwavering dedication can accomplish. A reminder that justice can be delayed, but not always denied. And a promise kept to a daughter, a wife, and a mother whose life was stolen far too soon. If this case moved you, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments below. Every story deserves to be remembered.